Well, joining us now is TalkTV's international editor, Isabel Oakeshott, who helped the former Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, write his pandemic diaries. Isabel, I mean, it's interesting. Boris submitted this 200-page preamble to the inquiry and, released bits and bobs into the news, suggesting that he thinks the inquiry should be discussing whether lockdowns were a good idea at all, whether we should be discussing the origins of the virus. And yet, it seems to me now he's taken to the stand. There's a lot of mea culpa. Well, I did like lockdowns. I tried my best. I mean, where is he on this?
Well, I think actually it's classic Boris. Remember, this is a man in the run-up to deciding whether he was going to be pro-Brexit or pro-Remain, wrote essays which made one case and an essay that made the other case. And in his evidence today, half of what he's saying seems to be, oops, we should have locked down a bit earlier in hindsight. But yet, on the other hand, actually, I don't have any regrets. I'm paraphrasing here. He is a bit all over the place. And I think it's a reflection of just how all over the place the advice he was getting was at that time. So the inquiry so far has focused on those weeks in the run-up to the announcement of the first national lockdown. And he's explained quite powerfully how difficult it was for him in his position to be presented with endless, on the one hand, and on the other, evidence from the so-called experts. On the one hand, he was being told, well, what they call the reasonable worst-case scenario is that X number of 100,000 people may die. And on the other hand, people were telling him, but it actually all could come to not very much. It might just be like a flu pandemic. And he pointed out this morning how many false alarms there have been, if you like. I mean, we can all remember many occasions when there was SARS and MERS and other things that never did quite become pandemics. And he actually used an example I probably, had I been advising him, said probably don't use the mad cow disease example. He did use the mad cow disease example, pretty much saying, well, look at all the cows that died unnecessarily. Not sure it was an entirely judicious choice of analogies to use, but the point he made was a reasonable one, that many times in the past there have been disasters that didn't come to pass.
But of course, he is picking up the narrative of this inquiry. Don't question the lockdowns. I mean, the lockdowns are marvellous. We just didn't do it early enough or extensively enough. And listen to what he just said in that clip. We did lock down, but then it bounced back. Oh, really, Boris? Is that true? We did lock down and then it bounced back. We did lock down again and then it bounced back. We locked down again and then it bounced back. This, to me, indicates that lockdowns didn't work, and yet this inquiry won't inquire into that. And Boris Johnson has joined this long, empty chorus of people saying we didn't lock down early enough or extensively.
Well, he hasn't quite. I think it's a little unfair. I think he's probably been, so far, pretty much the only one that has injected an element of doubt into that. And I think it's something of a test for his character, how far he will go on that, because we know that instinctively he didn't want to lock down and that he was trying to present the alternative case. And, every single one of his most senior advisors, the key people around him, all the so-called experts and the doom-mongering scientific advisors were all saying, well, look, Prime Minister, if you don't do this, 800...
I've got this model I made.
It'll all be on you. So, to that extent, I think many of us can have some sympathy. You'd have had to have a phenomenal appetite for risk as a Prime Minister to go against every single one of the so-called experts.
I would say, though, Isabel, I mean, if you remember, I can't remember how many Christmases ago it was it 3? He saved Christmas. Do you remember that? When he finally said, enough, I'm not going to listen to you scientists and you medics and you scaremongers telling me we've got to lock everyone down for Christmas. I'm letting Christmas go ahead. Yeah. And frankly, that was the beginning of the end of the crisis. So I think Boris's personal journey was to come well, maybe has come to the point that maybe lockdowns were a bad idea, but like all the other politicians, he won't admit it.
I also think it's a shame we've only got 2 days of Boris Johnson. He is the single most important witness in this entire inquiry. Honestly, I don't really want to hear a huge amount from the bereaved families. We know their tragedies. We know they lost people. We know it was awful for them. Actually, to get to the heart of this matter, we want to hear from the Prime Minister and the one or two key people And I think we could probably have had 2 weeks of Boris Johnson, not rushing it through. And by the way, an awful lot less grandstanding from the KC would be welcome.
Oh, gosh, I know. He's really irritating, isn't he? Oh, Keith.
Like this.
Oh,
Yeah,
Keith.
he's sort of somewhere
just-
between being languid,
Yeah.
you know, but sort of very theatrically bored by the whole thing.
Yeah.
And yet, on the other hand, trying to land these gotcha moments. You know, these are the matters of the most enormous importance.
He's on television, he's loving it.
But the problem is, yes, it's interesting to say gotcha moments, because all the gotcha moments we've had so far seem to revolve around WhatsApp messages. And I say thank the Lord, actually, that Boris's have been lost in the post and so have Rishi Sunak's, because I'm wondering, what is this? Whether or not someone should use an expletive in a crisis, whether or not you sort of get irritated or frustrated by your colleagues when the world seems to be on fire, or whether or not we should be talking about where this virus came from, and if something like this happens again, what do we do? I mean, Russell, what's your interpretation of this inquiry so far?
Apart from the fact that it's pointless, because it doesn't really get to the root of the problem. And look, will we learn anything from this? Of course not. I suspect if there's a similar travesty that lands on these shores in a year or 2 years' time, we won't have learned any lessons. And of course, because politicians and the scientists are knee-deep in self-protection, all they're thinking about is exactly this scenario here. I do not want to be personally culpable insofar as a future inquiry. So I think it's very easy to look at this also through the prism of hindsight. Of course, there were things that should have been done differently. But let's be clear, in defence of Boris Johnson and others, we have never been subjected to this type of situation before. And all of the planning previously is never going to allow politicians and scientists to have absolute crystal clarity insofar as what to do. Boris Johnson, Isabel's just made the point around almost Asia crying wolf, I suppose you'd say, where we have had many, many instances where the same experts, the likes of Ferguson and others, have said bird flu, mad cow's disease, SARS could kill millions and millions of people. Ebola, for instance. We were told Ebola was going to almost kill half the planet. I'm exaggerating slightly, but that was the hyperbole around such diseases.
I mean, the other difficulty they had in January, February was that the main sort of data was coming out of China. Insofar as there was any data, the images, where it all started was China. One of the most mendacious regimes on the planet. You know, the government was not getting reliable information from China about what was truly going on. We can all remember the horrific images from China of all their people in hazmat suits, you know, ordering everyone to do this and that, scenes of absolute disaster. But how do you know what to make of that? This is China we're talking about. You know, their reflex to authoritarianism is absolutely ingrained in every breath they take.
Boris was very clear at the beginning of his evidence that, you know, even the so-called scientists, the experts, were not expressing the seriousness of this. And why would they? It was unprecedented. And of course, that word has been used.
They seem to be getting a lot of instructions by fax from the World Health Organization as well. And what I want to know is what trumps what? Was it UK scientists like Chris Whitty who said lockdowns are going to come with a great amount of harm? Or was it the World Health Organization having chats with Xi Jinping and saying, well, actually, you've got to weld everyone's front doors shut?
Yeah.
Well, the World Health Organization was not actually acting as fast as some in government would have liked it to have done. I remember writing with Matt Hancock his book, he was quite frustrated by how slow the World Health Organization was to declare it a global pandemic. Why does that matter? I guess because once something's got that official status, then everybody kind of sits up and takes much more notice. The other thing I would say, in terms of Boris's evidence this morning, you know, the point you made about whether people are swearing in WhatsApps, I think you made that point. I mean, Boris Johnson made a reasonable defence of that, just saying, look, you know, if you strip back anyone's WhatsApps, you know, that's just how people talk to each other in the heat of the moment. It doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter.
I think there's been far
and that
too much
has become
emphasis on
the
this.
tabloid story, rather than the likes of Beth Rigby and Robert Peston, you know, standing up and grandstanding themselves, making their 10-minute-long questions, which were then all about the most irrelevant and infinitesimal aspects of this. And of course, at the time, back in 2020-21, who was asking, actually, apart from this channel and one or two others, maybe only one or two others, the effect of what was being done in terms of the lockdown on the economy, on mental health and so on. We're now seeing the effects of that, not least inflation, interest rates and so on. No one asked those questions.
The government,
Boris, why haven't you locked down more?
No one asked those questions.
Look, this is early days of this inquiry, which could
Unfortunately.
literally could drag on till about 2030. The mind boggles. But it has cost more than £100 million. So given that it is now up and running and we are supposed to be learning lessons, this is what this inquiry is all about. Would you say we've learned anything so far, Isabel?
I learned one really big thing last week. Well, I didn't learn it, but it's something that I can at least hold on to tell other people, which is that they just systematically misled us on mask wearing. Yes. And that's really important. There's still people all over the streets wearing masks. Guys, the Deputy Chief Medical Officer just admitted last week, she admitted that these things were utterly useless. So if that tells you something, it tells you that senior people can mislead.
One other aspect about the vaccine, you know, it's being perpetuated. It was the vaccine effectively that got rid of, inverted commas, the horror of COVID. It wasn't. It was Omicron. It was the natural progression of any virus that dilutes itself in terms of allowing itself to survive. If there'd been no vaccine, Omicron ultimately would have diluted the effect in any case.
And do you remember, because it was the beginning of December, this was the year where Boris finally saved us by saying, I'm not locking down at Christmas. If you remember, we're looking at the data coming out of South Africa where Omicron started. Their chief medical officer was even writing pieces in our newspaper saying, this is what you're looking for. This Omicron...
But Kevin took us
I know, that's my point, Russell, that Chris Whitty, in the face of this plethora of evidence that Omicron was mild and therefore would signal the end of the COVID crisis, Chris Whitty for 3 weeks said, no, there's so many cases we may have to lock down again. Why would they not listen to what was going on in South Africa?
Well, by then, I think they just got into a whole reflex of, lockdowns are OK. I mean, lockdowns literally cost billions every week that you did them. And it's not just money, of course, it's lives in other ways.
But it's also a politician's natural instinct, as I said at the beginning, to try and protect themselves. So they weren't probably going to get the blame for excess deaths, you know, people from heart disease and cancer, those people that hadn't been treated
the mess
during
they've
COVID.
left behind
They weren't going to get the blame for that, but they might have got the blame insofar as what happened during COVID. The other thing, just to reference as well, is, of course, the admission on Twitter, I think it was from Ferguson, where he was challenged, I think it was by The Spectator, with regard to the numbers that they had used when forecasting the effect of COVID. And it was admitted that they only used extreme worst-case scenarios for that modelling.
Right. And his random number generator.
Not a probability.
Next slide, please.
Not a probability, but the extreme worst-case scenario.
Guys, thank you so much for your thoughts on that. Gosh, it seems like so long ago now, COVID, but how did we go through it all? I just don't know. Do you know, I do know I went to Lanzarote and lived there. And
oh, that's all right for you. I remember you doing that. The rest of us suffered.